Thank you so much, Hannah. Good evening, everyone, for what promises to be, I'm not sure quite how to put this, I think an impassioned debate, I think it's fair to say. I'm going to describe it in this way. Imagine you had a house. Some of you may say that's a fantasy, but that's another conversation altogether. But imagine you had a house and it needs some work. And one builder comes along, sucks his teeth, builders always suck their teeth, and says, well, you know, bit of a paint job, redo the electrics, some new windows, you're there. Well, I think that's one side of this conversation. Yeah, it'll be good as new. The next guy comes along, because you have to get two quotes, right? So the next guy comes along and he says, you're mad. This place is falling down. Just get rid of it, knock it down, start again. It'll be fabulous. I think that's the nub of the debate we're going to have today. What do you choose? We've got two fantastic speakers here. Martin Wolf is Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. He's often described as one of the most influential economic commentators in the world. His latest book is The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And Yanis Varoufakis is an economist who served as the Greek Minister of Finance from January to July 2015, and he's currently Professor of Economics at the University of Athens. He's the author of numerous best-selling books, the last of which is now Dispatches from an Alternative Present, and his next book coming out in September is called Techno-feudalism. Welcome to you both. Before we get going, one more thing quickly to explain to all of you. There will be lots of time for questions. There is a roving microphone. We will get to all of you at some point. So if you're on the sides, I won't ignore you. We will try and get in as many questions as we can. And both Martin and Yanis will be signing books at the end. That's enough of that. Let's get going. So, Martin, your book has the word crisis in the title. Why do you believe that democratic capitalism, despite that, is the best political and economic system that we have?
Well, I think it's pretty clearly the best political and economic system that we have if we look around the world as it is today. You have to compare something with... You can't compare something, as it were, in my view, with nothing. That's just moonbeams. So, and of course, there have been many very serious attempts to create alternative systems. By now, the idea of revolutionary socialism is hardly a novelty. We've been at that for, let's say, 120 years, roughly. And without going into detail, it's pretty clear that didn't end very well. I won't talk about the gulags and all the rest of it, or what's going on in China today, whatever you regard that. And so I think I start with the position that as things are now, and if you look back over the last couple of centuries, these systems, which have changed over time, they're protean, they adapt, have developed something quite unique. So one of the points I make in my book, 200 years ago, according to very recognized scholars, there were no democracies. Nothing that you could even begin to describe as one in an organized state. And nowadays, even in this democratic recession, as we call it, more than half of the regimes of the world have significant democratic elements. Voting is taken seriously, and if you have significant democratic elements, there's some sort of rule of law, there has to be some sort of degree of protection for the election process itself, and these are all protections for citizens, having alternative political parties that you can choose. These are really valuable, and I argue in my book, perhaps I don't have time to explain now, that those were in fact a natural consequence of the forces brought into being by the market revolution, market capitalism, and it's why this has only emerged in those sorts of societies, or something like those societies. And my basic argument on that is if you have the alternatives have always been complete state-controlled systems, and in completely state-controlled systems, the state holds all the power, and losing power is catastrophic, so nobody is ever prepared to think about it. So you need the decentralization of the economy and the existence of a wide sphere of activity which is outside politics to protect politics from itself. That seems to be the very quickly that. But there's one additional thing which is obviously pretty important, you can't underestimate it. Over the last 200 years, and we really need imagination about this, the lives of people in a society like this have been completely transformed. Life expectancy has gone up 2.5 times to levels nobody could have imagined before. Infant mortality has fallen from 3 to 500 per thousand to 3. Obviously, our ability to treat people has transformed. The range of goods and services we can enjoy, the choices of careers and activities we enjoy, are unimmeasurably greater. So it seems to be pretty clear. It really is the worst system except all the others. And what I want to do, because we're going to come to what's gone wrong, I want to make it work much better than it has been.
So I think Yanis is already doing some teeth sucking, but what we're talking about is the symbiosis between, I guess, democracy and capitalism. You are very much a Democrat. You're raising your eyebrows. What's wrong with Martin's analysis? We've never had it so good.
I don't realize that I raised my eyebrows. I agree with what Martin said. Look, before we get stuck into our disagreements, let's establish the common ground, which is important. Otherwise, you can't have a genuine conversation. The common ground is that we both believe in democracy, and we both believe in decentralized market systems. Because the alternative is central planning, which either takes the form of Gosplan in the Soviet Union, we know how that ended, or Amazon.com, which is another form of the Soviet system. It's actually even worse.
Get to that later.
In the sense that it is totally centralized and the exact opposite of both democracy and the market. Amazon.com is not a market. Platform is not a market. It's a simulation of a market, but not of the kind that Adam Smith had in mind, or any liberal would have in mind or tolerate. So we agree on that. And the struggle to deter tyranny from rising up, the struggle to prevent ourselves, each one of us, because we have a darkness in ourselves as human beings, and whenever we acquire power, this darkness becomes more powerful and more insidious and more dangerous. I think as true children of the Enlightenment, we are on that common ground. By the way, congratulations on the book. It's a great read. You should read it. And highly informative. Even though I have covered in my own professional life all those areas and periods and so on, I learned a lot. The gist of it, as I see it, and I think you already said it, Martin, is that you recognize that, call it what you might, liberal democratic capitalism, is the best of all alternatives, but it is also broken and needs to be fixed. And you have ideas of how to do this. So the big question is, and I think this is also reflected in the title. Yeah. Should we fix it? Should we abandon it? What should we do about it? Now, here is where the differentiation between our views begins. Imagine this were 1776 here in London. And we're having a conversation about the system that prevailed at the time, which we now call feudalism. They didn't call it feudalism, right? Or it was still considered along the lines of feudalism. And imagine there was a whole conversation about how to civilize it. That conversation would have been besides the point, because by the 1770s, feudalism was on the way out. There was already a very powerful economic and social force called capital that was replacing land as a source of value added and power. Mm-hmm. And that led to the conflict between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the merchant class, and to some synthesis, which is liberal democratic capitalism. I didn't choose 1776 randomly. It was a year when Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations. The whole point about that book was to say that there is this transformation, historic, great transformation, in the words of Karl Polanyi, taking place. And the old was being jettisoned by forces that nobody really understood. And this is why Adam Smith's book became such a great bestseller, because things were happening that people had no clue of how to explain them. You had a new class emerging that was extremely powerful economically, but for the first time, economic and political power were differentiated, had split up. Up until then, if you had political power, you were the prince, the baron, the king. You also had economic power. But at some point, you have these merchants that are scum in the eyes of the aristocracy, but they have more power, more money than the aristocracy. So there was a need to explain how the rise of capital and the usurpation of land and the replacement of ground rent by profit and capital accumulation was changing the world. I feel, this is my conviction, and that's why I'm finishing a book now that you very kindly mentioned, is coming out in September. I feel that we are at a similar juncture, that capitalism is being undermined and replaced by a new socioeconomic mode of production, which is highly problematic, very interesting, fascinating, huge challenge for humanity, and who is the agent of change? In the 1770s, it was merchant capital, it was capital accumulation, it was capital. The agent of change today is again capital. It's not the left. The left, we have failed spectacularly at transforming the world. When we did transform the world, we made a mess of it. And then we just went to ground, and we are now, my party is at 4%. In Greece. And the Labour Party is not even trying anymore under Keir Starmer to transform anything except themselves. So it's capital. Capital has produced, in my view, a mutation of capital. I call it cloud capital, algorithmic capital.
The tech companies.
Yes, but not so much the capital. It's a new form of, allow me just very quickly to explain what I'm saying. Capital, the way I understand it, is a produced means of production. Anything that's been produced in order to produce other stuff, whether it's a steam engine, an industrial robot, a 3D printer. You produce something to produce other stuff. That's a produced means of production. Cloud capital is a produced means of behavioral modification. So, preaching, discussing, advertising, marketing is an attempt at behavior modification. But when behavior modification, the agent of it is capital, machinery, an algorithm, which is in a dialectical conversation with people in their own homes over the phone and so on. Alexa, Amazon's Alexa. What exactly is Amazon's Alexa? It's a machine that trains you to train it, to train you to train it, to train it, to convince you to buy stuff through first impressing you with fantastic proposals as to what you should buy, and then sells it to you using the same algorithm, bypassing the market via a platform. That is a new kind of algorithm.
I'm fascinated that you've identified the power of the algorithm in quite that way, because having read your last book, I obviously haven't read the new book, I imagined one of the points I wanted to make to you was, does the power of the algorithm and the way in which it sucks our attention, does that make it much harder to persuade people to engage in the kind of society, in the kind of political change that you envisage or imagine in that book?
Not necessarily. I don't want to be pessimistic, and I don't want to have this surveillance capitalism view that Big Brother is here and our minds have been hijacked. I'm talking about a new form of capital which creates a new feudalism up in the cloud, because if you think about it, today you've got millions of producers producing apps for Apple, for Google, for Facebook, physical products that they sell through Amazon. And when you get it from them, they pay, or you pay, or together you and the producer pay 30% of a ground rent to the owner of the new land, which is the cloud. And so we are Martin, in his book, he talks about rentier capitalism. Yeah. I think now we've moved beyond rentier capitalism.
Okay, Martin,
this is not capitalism anymore. It's a kind of cloud rent feudalism.
Martin, how much, there's a really sophisticated critique of capitalism in your book, but how much does the tech world, the power of the tech world, the sheer numbers in terms of money, the way in which we're all sucked into it, how much does that distort any analysis?
So I think Yanis is raising a very, very interesting question. And this is where I would be at the, so I have a much less apocalyptic view on this, which doesn't mean I'm not really quite worried. I mean, I think the idea, first of all, I think this is a clarification. Yanis, being very firmly in the left, sees the notion of capitalism, which is of course really linked to Marxist theories, as central. I think of the central thing as decentralized market mechanisms.
Right.
And of course, the dynamic they generated when this got going, because people could own claims on the means of production, and they worked out ways of going roundabout in producing things. So instead of having somebody make something directly, they made machines to make machines that made these things. We start thinking as the dominant thing of it, the physical capital, which was created to generate more productivity, and which was, of course, the means of production, and was owned by the bourgeoisie. And on top of that, the financial system was created. That's a useful analysis, but to me, what underlies that is simply that was the response to the technological and market opportunities in that time. And that remained the dominant model. I accept that the market plus technology together, it's pretty clearly, it's always technology in the market. We have created vast numbers of industries we take for granted because of the interaction of technological innovation and market processes, and got all those electric lights, which in my view were more miraculous than most tech. Now, we've thrown up a new technological system which has some very powerful features. The most important, I think, are zero marginal costs over all directions, massive network effects, and very powerful means of influencing the behavior of human beings, which Yanis was talking about. And there is no doubt in my mind, and this creates immense concentrations of private power, which is why I've become very concerned in my writing about plutocracy, of which capitalism, if you like, is one version. But there have been, as Yanis was pointing out, plutocrats used to control land, and they control capital. Now they obviously control the rents generated by these systems. But I believe that the politics created by market processes, which included radical increases in wealth and bringing in the possibility of building systems in which everybody could have a political voice, they're still open to us to ameliorate the consequences of this, and it's part of what I talk. So I think, it's a question of, am I right? The politics can change this, but if I'm wrong, then it's going to be a problem for everybody, including Yanis. So I think there has to be really serious competition policy, and I think a lot of these companies have to be broken up. They should never have been allowed to buy all the companies they did. And we clearly have to think much more seriously than we have about how we regulate the way algorithmic systems work. I have no doubt the challenges that these are going to create, including increasingly now AI as part of this, are going to be immense. They're going to be immense to any social organization, and it's perfectly plausible that we will decide that some of this cannot be left, in fact, very plausible, cannot be just left in the hands of private profit-seeking entities to do whatever they like. I mean, this is one of the reasons by now, not ideally, banking has become so regulated. So I'm perfectly open to that. I think there's a lot we're going to do, but I don't accept that this is the end of all possible conversations about how we reform market through things that have been created by technology markets through the reaction of both competition itself and politics, which is what we've always done. and the key point in my book is the capitalist system of today, whatever you call it, the market system, what I mean, is completely different from that of 2 centuries ago. Adam Smith, by the way, missed almost all of that. He had no idea of growth, which is really extraordinary. He was a genius, of course, a very important thinker, but he didn't know he didn't understand there will be growth coming. So I think we shouldn't despair, and we mustn't despair, and we must say these are real problems, and we're going to have to find ways of tackling them, and waiting until we get some overwhelming revolutionary transformation is to me a doctrine of despair. I'm not saying this is what Yanis believes or is going to propose, but what is true, clear, it is discussed in my book at some length, there are many other things. This is a huge challenge, and we haven't yet really recognized it. That is true.
Yanis, reform is always possible, change is always possible. We don't have to accept this techno-feudalism, to use your phrase, as it is.
I don't accept anything. I don't take anything for granted. None of us are. The question is, firstly, what is the diagnosis? And secondly, what is the cure? My diagnosis is that the emergence and proliferation of what I call cloud capital is sidelining the 2 major pillars of capitalism, which are profits and markets. If I'm right in this, then our policy prescriptions, a cure, has to adapt to this dynamic, if I'm right in this. Let me explain very briefly what I mean by this. I said before, I hinted at it by saying that Amazon is not a market. It looks like a market because you go in there and there are millions of consumers and millions of producers. But it's not a market because everything is mediated via an algorithm that belongs to one man. So when we think of markets, we think of the market town, which is the basic, sort of paradigm in our head. If you want to understand Amazon or Alibaba or any of these big platforms, what's wrong with this? It's not working. There you are. We're still in another feudal, not techno-feudal realm.
There's the cloud when you
need it. Yes. Turn it on and off.
So briefly, so I don't belabor the point. Imagine we were to get out of here, Notting Hill, and we're walking down the street together, right? And we realized in this science fiction world that I'm creating for you now, that every house, every shop is owned by one man. And everything that's sold is mediated through this person. And not only that, but as we train our eyes in the same direction, in the same shopping window, what you see is different to what I see. And what I see and what you see is determined by the same algorithm, which then sells us the stuff directly, bypassing the market. That's not my understanding of a market. That's my understanding of a fief, a kind of cloud fief, or a digital fief that belongs to one person. Then you have rivalry, because there are many different fiefs. You have Alibaba, you've got Amazon, you've got many different, but each one of them is a fief. Now, they were fiefs under feudalism, and there was rivalry between them. In addition to this, Martin has written extensively and brilliantly about what led to the 2008 great financial collapse and how the responses have been so suboptimal as to create, again, a kind of rentierism that is detrimental to growth, to equality, to democracy, and so on. We've both written about that. But there's a connection with my story about cloud capital. Because come to think of it, the quantitative easing inflated financial assets, while austerity, not just George Osborne, but European austerity, even American austerity, seriously diminished investment in productive capital. So you had this disconnect between liquidity, available liquidity was huge, and investment which was low. And that was one of the reasons why we had negative interest rates and low interest rates. The only capital that accumulated massively during that 13-year period between 2008 and the end of the pandemic was cloud capital. It was the techno, the big tech, that managed to take this capital and invest hugely. And that was at the expense of markets, if I'm right that Amazon is not a market, at the expense of traditional capitalism, at the expense of our democracies, at the expense of the concept of the sovereign agent, the liberal individual, because of the way the algorithms mess with our minds. Now, when we reach this point, can we still talk about a social democratic project of harmonizing taxation and therefore ameliorating the dynamics of inequality, of breaking up these how do you break up Google? The whole point about Google is you cannot break it up because it's an international thing. It has to be an international, internet-based thing. It's not like Standard Oil. Standard Oil, could have been broken up easily because the rate of accumulation of the oil did not depend on it being a whole.
Martin, I'm going to let you come back on some of that if you'd like to, and I want to ask you about another exception that interests me.
So I don't see this in such catastrophic terms at all. To me, do I like Amazon? Well, I use it.
I use it too. I didn't ask you whether you like it.
There's a confession.
It saves me immeasurable amounts of time. The products are usually breathtakingly cheap. I really don't think I bought anything that I didn't intend to because I come on to buy something. I'm really quite grateful that they deliver it to me and that I don't have to wander all over London to find it. Of course, I recognize this has very bad side effects on small businesses, but so did department stores, so did supermarkets. I recognize there's a difference here. I just don't accept it's that big. By the way, Amazon is not a particularly profitable company.
Because they're very good accountants. They never pay tax because they're never profitable.
You can't hide it that well.
They do.
Of course, part of it, of course, is because they invest massively, and that's tax deductible to some degree. But that's investment. A lot of that is investment in real things like warehouses, so forth. Finally, I'd just say this again. The degree to which people are manipulated, there are exceptions, of course. I think that's been a complaint ever since advertising first came. This isn't new, the hidden persuaders. And it's true up to a point. But I've always actually felt that most people in the end mostly end up buying what they actually want and what they care about. And then finally, just look at what our economy actually consists of. The tech business is important, and they've certainly been remarkably profitable, the reasons I say. But actually, if you look at the sectors over time that in our economy tend to grow, relative to everything else, it's labor-intensive services. And the reason for that is all the other stuff has become so dirt cheap. We've deindustrialized massively, if you look at economic data, because the economic system can produce the sorts of things that Amazon sells incredibly cheaply. Some of that's problematic, and it's become a really small part of GDP, and Amazon isn't that big either. So I think that I understand the concerns, and I'm more concerned actually about Facebook than I am, and that sort of manipulation than I am, and its political role than I am about Amazon. Google is really very convenient. By the way, they bought an enormous number of companies. All of these entities did, and those could have been prevented. It's more difficult to reverse, and we could have had much more competition, and I'd be very happy to have Alibaba around too. But the idea that these people are uncontrollable by serious politicians, political forces, if they want to control them, that they basically run us all, that they have unimaginably huge profits which aren't just beyond all computing in terms of previous businesses. I just don't think that's correct. I think there is a very important kernel of truth, and there's a very big danger that if we just let them do what they want, and there are lots of ideas, but I think that the idea that we're suddenly in something where competition no longer applies. By the way, Google at the moment is absolutely terrified that, as I understand it, that the new chatbot AI is going to destroy a lot of their business. Technology gives and technology destroys, and it has always done so.
I'm going to turn the corner slightly, and I'm interested in both your thoughts on this, but Martin, if I can begin with you. You talk in the book about predatory capitalism, demagogic capitalism, but I wonder if, given where we are now, it's possible to speculate that it's the authoritarian capitalism of China that might actually end up triumphing.
I think that's one. I of course, have a section, quite a number of sections on that fundamental issue. So where might we be going? And here I'd be surprised Yanis might agree. So we have our limping and current very problematic democratic capitalism, but in some countries, at least, we still have elections. We still have an open process. We can still meet like this and say more or less what we think, and at least on these subjects.
And we largely have a peaceful transfer of power.
And we have a large... Now, what are the two alternatives we're seeing emerge? The first is what I call autocratic capitalism. There are other terms, much of which nowadays doesn't come from coups against democracy, which were very common, of course, and probably the most horrifying example of this process in history is Germany in the early 30s. Somebody gets elected, that somebody is an authoritarian, and that person basically eats out the whole democratic system from within, replacing independent institutions, electoral commissions, broadcasting institutions, which fully with people, filling their people with their people, doing similarly with what the Russians used to call the power ministries, the espionage services, the army, the police, the justice system. And lo and behold, after 10 years, 20 years of this, the person is a dictator, and the system that started off as a democratic one has ended up as a dictatorship. And I think there's a pretty long list of this, and my view is there are things going on in many countries, but the most important obviously is the US, which look dangerously like this. Now, the other system we are seeing is actually really only exists in one or possibly two countries, namely China and Vietnam, which are the relics of the great Bolshevik revolutions of the 20th century. And it has to be said that Deng Xiaoping, who I do regard as one of the most brilliant politicians leaders in world history, seeing the bankruptcy of that system, realized that he could marry these very powerful bureaucratic systems rooted in Chinese tradition, because they really, don't forget, really serious bureaucracy on a large scale they invented, more or less, can be allied to markets under political control. And he generated the most astonishing growth and transformation of any society ever, and created a superpower, on many measures the biggest economy in the world. And it certainly isn't democratic, nor would it pretend to be. But they can easily claim, despite I think they have very real economic weaknesses, that they plan longer, they can mobilize resources, both human and physical and anything else they want, on a scale never ever seen before. They can utterly transform their country in unimaginably short periods of time. So I'll just give you one example which it sort of captures the difference between us and them in this respect. In about 20 years, they built 15,000 kilometers, I think that's the right number, of high-speed railway. 20 years, beginning to end. I won't discuss how they got the technology. They were very good and clever about that too. We are going to spend 40 years failing to build 300 miles north of London. By the way, in America, it's even worse.
Yep.
So our systems have got to the point, they are so, this is a sort of Frank Fukuyama point, if I probably shouldn't mention that name here, but anyway, that we have created a democratic system, one of whose characters is that we fail to control these people. And another of it is we stop ourselves from doing almost anything and running anything well. So it is perfectly imaginable that 20, 30 years from now, China will be the dominant system in the world. They'll still have about 1 billion people, and lots of people around the world, and I think quite a lot of people in developing and emerging countries are already saying, that's the way to go, because it works. And it is to me, that's pretty damn scary.